Well, good evening. I'm Charley Dewberry. I'm one of the tutors here. And what I'm going to talk a little about tonight is Freud and his influence on how we think about man and what influence he had. And I'm not a psychologist by training. I'm a philosopher. So my interest in reading Freud is I am interested in general what his theories are, but what really interests me is what are the assumptions that he makes that he doesn't even think about? What's the underlying foundation of his theory? And so that's the kind of thing that interests me. And what I would say is I think Freud and a few others, in particular Freud and Darwin, are the two people that have most influenced how we think of man in the 20th and 21st century. So he's the guy that sort of has shaped who we are. And as I say, shaped who we are in a way that we don't even ask about that, or we don't even think about that. That those sort of issues were decided long ago. Everybody knows that this is the case, so they're no longer questioned anywhere. Those are the kind of issues that interest me, because we all have those kind of assumptions in basically everything we do. Those assumptions come out of our culture. They're part of a long history. So what I'm going to do tonight is first just give just a smidgen of an overview of Freud, the parts that interest me. And then I'm going to move to looking at those underpinnings. And I think we'll see that they've influenced how virtually most all scientists approach the issue of man and issues about man. And as a culture, how we think about ourselves. So with that, first I'll launch into just a tiny little bit of Freud. I would guess that there's a number of you here that know way more about Freud than I do, but these are the pieces that are of interest to me. So first, Freud was a graduate student in Vienna, and Vienna at the time was the leading medical school probably in Western civilization. So he got a graduate appointment to the leading school in Europe for sure, if not in all the world. And his training was in neurophysiology and neurology. And his major professor was a guy named Ernst Brücke. And they were all part of a program in Germany that was trying to recast biology as a science. And one of the people in this program was a guy named Hermann Helmholtz. And basically what interested Hermann Helmholtz is the idea of conservation of energy. That you can change energy's form, but you can't create it or destroy it. There's the same amount of energy in the world all the time. This will become important as we come back to Freud. So in their view, energy can radically change its form, but in any closed system, the overall energy content has to remain constant. So as part of a pact, all this group of grad students and major professors that were basically forming this new view of biology, they took a pact. We will accept no statement in biology that's not reducible to chemistry and physics. Now I'll come back to that, because that's a very interesting assumption. So Freud was part of that. And he graduated, but he had a problem. His problem was Vienna is the most Catholic institution in Western Europe at that point in time. Freud is a Jew. That's a problem. He knows he's never going to get an appointment. He's never going to be able to teach there. He's never going to be able to really do research. So he has to figure out what he wants to do. So he decides he's going to practice neurology. That's what he's going to do. So what kind of patients does a neurologist get in mid-19th century? And virtually all the patients you're going to get are patients that have some kind of abnormal insensitivities. I mean, one of the classic cases was called glove anesthesia, that you're a person who has no feeling in a hand, but yet the neurologists know that's impossible. That can't happen. Physically, that cannot happen. It has to have a cause that's not physical. So one of the real problems that Freud has to face here is, well, we know that there are certain kind of abnormal sensitivities that are physically based. But he also knows through his own experience, plus others, that there are situations where they're not physically based. They're not, the underlying cause of this abnormality is not physical. So these patients are often called patients with hysteria. Now, the way Freud approached this topic, and again, this is what I find very interesting, is in his view, what's happened to this person is there's a blockage in their psychic energy. There's a blockage in the normal way energy would move. As a result of that blockage, it's going to manifest itself with a change in form of psychic energy. Okay, so this is his view of the cause of the hysteria. So notice that Freud, even though he says they're not ultimately caused by physical things, ultimately he's claiming it is a physical cause. It's the psychic energy that's blocked, and he means physically blocked. So that's his picture of how he's trying to diagnose the cause of these cases of hysteria or abnormal insensitivities. Well, he goes to France to study hypnosis with a guy named Charcot. I know nothing about French. I butcher it completely. So anyway, he goes and he begins to study hypnosis because he's heard that under hypnosis that people have had some success in relieving these kind of abnormalities. And while he's there, this is at a point in time when an individual named Mesmer, who was kind of the guru of hypnosis, he becomes, shall we say, in his own mind, he becomes a superstar. He becomes the rock star of hypnosis, to the point that this becomes like an act. He's dressing up in these incredible clothes, and his claim is, hypnosis can't work without me. I understand how to do it, and I'm the guru of all of this. Well, the French were it created a real stir in Paris. And in fact, the authorities decided, okay, this has gone far enough. And the scientists in France were just absolutely appalled that, this hypnosis, this is just show. This is just entertainment, what it's been turned into. So they pulled together a scientific panel to determine the credibility of hypnosis. But they had to come up with somebody that was really credible, who had just an exceptional reputation as a scientist, above reproach. So whatever this committee came up with, it'd be rock solid. So here's a great question if you're into any kinds of games or anything over. Who chaired that committee that questioned Mesmer? Does anybody know? You do? Okay, who? Oh, that's correct, Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin was the scientist they picked to chair this committee that in the end claimed that Mesmer's version of hypnosis does not pass the test of being scientific. Now, they did not say that some other formulation might be made such, but Mesmer's didn't got it. So that was how they ruled. Well, at that point, Freud decided that he was going to leave hypnosis alone for the most part. And he had kind of three reasons for doing that. First, not every patient could be brought under hypnosis. I mean, normally if we're doing science, it all works the same every time. So first, not every patient could be brought under hypnosis. Second, the therapeutic effects of hypnosis on these symptoms was short-lived, wouldn't last very long. So the patient would have some immediate improvement in their symptoms, but it'd come back in a fairly short period of time. And then there's the third reason, that the whole thing seemed kind of mystical to him, that it just didn't quite cut science as done by a neurophysiologist. That this method of science, or the method of science as he understood it at that time, this whole idea of hypnosis just seemed like it wasn't going to make the grade. And he was always very conscious of his status and his reputation being a Jew in a very Catholic city. So after he then set aside hypnosis, he began to work with what became known as a talking cure. As that he found that by talking with patients who had these symptoms, that just the act of expressing themselves would relieve these symptoms. And sometimes the relief would be indefinite, that they wouldn't come back. So he began then to try to develop this method of talking and to make it efficient and make it scientific. And so his key assumption was that these hysterical symptoms were the result of a repressive mechanism. That something was causing your psychological energy to get bottled up and blocked up. And so the symptoms we saw were this energy expressing itself in a different form. So in his mind, he wanted to develop further this talking cure as a way to relieve and restore the normal pathway that psychological energy would flow through the individual. So that's his working model of the problem as he saw it. So in his mind, as he began to develop psychoanalysis, it's a method to release the pressure of repressive mechanisms. And as most everyone knows, as he developed the theory, sexuality and sexual development became the core focus of the whole development process, and it became the central issue in the repressive mechanism. So with just that snapshot, a little bit of kind of Freud's work, where he went and what he did, what I would like to do is I need to set up a couple preliminary steps. We need a couple of just foundational ideas here to work with. So I'm going to shift gears for just a minute and lay some groundwork here. So the first thing I want to make a distinction between is the idea of a kind and the idea of something that differs by degree. That this is a fundamental difference. And once philosophy got separated from science, as the Enlightenment developed, this question kind of went away, because this is a philosophical question. You can't use science, you can't use the method of science to answer this kind of question. But everybody has a take, everybody has an assumption. And I think everybody in this room knows that after Darwin, we all know that there's no such thing as kinds. Everything differs by degree. So what Darwin had established in biology was the idea that everything differs by degree. There are no kinds. Well, there's a couple pieces of this I want to highlight here, because this will be the foundation of the whole thing. Is if something differs by kind, there's two things that are true about it. One is it has something that no other kind has. And I'll give some examples in a minute. But the other characteristic is, if you're a member of that group, in fact, every member of that group is just as much a member of that group as any other member. In other words, if you're in this kind, you're in it just as much as any other member that's of that kind. And it's totally different from any other kind. Okay? So that's the second, that all members are equal. And then there's a third, that you can have kinds, but they have rigid boundaries around them. And there's a gulf that can't be crossed. So let me give you an example. I'll start with, it's a little abstract, but I think it'll work. Let's just start with integers. So 1, 2, 3. So every number that's 1, and every number that's 2, and every number that's 3, each of those integers, every time we have a 1, it's just as much a 1 as any other. And in math, it's considered that if we're talking about integers, there's a gulf between these integers that we don't really know what is. There's no way to measure this. Okay, so in math, this is kind of what it looks like, but I'll give you a more practical example. In field geology, they have what they call a hardness scale. So it's 0 to 10, and they have a little packet with them. And so they pick up a rock. How hard is this rock? Well, 10 is diamond. And actually, I don't remember what 9 is the next thing. Maybe it's some kind of quartz. I don't know. But anyway, and it goes all the way down to 1 is chalk. And so you got these 10 things, and you scratch it. And you see where the scratches. So for instance, if you can scratch the stone here, but you can't scratch it here, then you know it's an 8. And all rocks that you would pick up that you can scratch here and not here, they're all equally hard. They're all 8s by the same test. They all are identically 8s. That's all you know about them. Okay? Does that make sense? You following what I'm saying? Okay. So, but the other piece of this is your quartz, your diamond, your these. We have no idea how much hardness is in between any of these things. There could be 10 times as much hardness difference between those two as this one, but we have no way of knowing. Okay? So this is important characteristics of kinds. Well, over here, let's take our integers. But if things differ by degree, what are we going to do with 1.5? What are we going to do with 1.7? They just differ by degree. So is 1 here and 1.7, they're not really the same. Because this is almost 2. So nothing is really just as much a member of that class. It's just a continuum. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. Well, what are the implications here? And let's go right to the one that interests us the most. Is man an animal? Does man differ by degree from animals, or is he of a qualitatively different kind? Well, after Darwin, anything that's biological has to differ by degree. What Darwin had determined was, it looks like there's kinds in nature. It looks like there's kinds, but there aren't really. Because we have this continuation, this continuous life. It's like a bush. And how it works is natural selection comes in and takes out some of this continuity. And so it looks like this is a class. It looks like this is a class, but they're not real. Because everything differs by degree. So we differ by degree from chimpanzees, we differ by degree from chickens, we differ by degree from monkeys, we differ by degree from protozoa, we differ by degree from broccoli. Everything's difference by degree. Now, the most important writings that Freud always had front and center in his library were all the writings of Darwin. So Darwin was the foundation that he started his work on. So Freud, he's not the only one, but Freud played a major role in bringing Darwin into psychology. And the implication here is that man is an animal. And what do we mean by an animal? What we mean by an animal is something that's like a mechanism. Its actions and behaviors are driven almost entirely by instinct. Okay? So Darwin's going to start out by looking at the instincts in man that are animal instincts. So obviously sex is one of the primary ones you're going to pick. All biological animals sexually reproduce. So in his view of psychology, what's the purpose of psychology? The purpose of psychology is for the animal, in this case man, to succeed. What does that mean? Well, function normally in society, so you're fit enough that you can reproduce and keep the species going. That's what it's about. That's what psychology is about. That's what it's for. So he's working with these instincts that are animal instincts. Okay, so let me stop for a minute and just see what kind of questions we have here. See what kind of questions we got. Questions at this point? You're all with me. Nobody wants to disagree? Okay. Well, there's one other aspect I want to bring into this. I want to go all the way back to his quote. Remember that pact that he took with his fellow grad students and with the professors in Germany? The one that says, we will accept no statement in biology that's not reducible to physics and chemistry. Okay? Let's come back to that and unpack that for a minute. So, according to this, we don't really, in the end, need to study biology at all. All we really need to do is study physics and biochemistry, because ultimately that's the explanation of all of it. So, for instance, when I was in grad school in philosophy, every once in a while I had a couple friends in the biology department, and at that time, there were like 2 people in the entire biology department that worked at a level higher than the cell. So I'd come in to wave my arms and talk about ecosystems in population biology. But to them, that was kind of a joke, because we all knew that what counts is biochemistry and biophysics, because that's where it's all at. Because ultimately, the cause of all of this is physics and chemistry. It's not biology. So even though Freud's working on a talking cure, and he recognizes that a lot of these symptoms don't really appear to be based in physics and chemistry, but ultimately his explanation is still this psychic energy. He's still maintaining this energy model. So it's still a model of human beings built on physics and chemistry. So what came from Freud here? Anything wrong psychologically? We got a pill to fix that. We're just chemical machines. Any problem you have, we can fix it with chemicals, because ultimately, that's it. That's the cause of everything. We are just chemical machines. For anybody that's hung around here for a while, and in philosophy, if you unpack this is straight materialism. All there is in the world is matter and energy. That's ultimately the view that Freud has brought to psychology. And he's not the only one. Virtually all of them are bringing it. But he's one of the more interesting ones that bring it, because on the surface, that's the last thing you'd think Freud's bringing. But no, he's bringing lock, stock, and barrel, first Darwin, the idea that we differ from the animals by degree, not by kind. There's nothing unique about man. We run by the same physical and chemical properties the animals do. It's just a difference of degree. We do things a little different than they do, but there's nothing about man that's any different from any other animal. So that's the first parts of Freud. What I'd like to do now for just a few minutes, and I want to leave quite a lot of time to see if we can find some things to talk about. So that's kind of the Freud perspective, and what I'd like to do is just kind of wrap that up with just some bullets of what we've sort of talked about. And then I want to contrast it with a biblical view. So what are some of the bullets here? Well, first, man is an animal. So if we want to understand human behavior, what are we going to do? We want to go back and see what animals were doing, because obviously we came out of that same evolutionary development. So we want to talk about sexuality. Well, let's go back and see what all the animals do, because we just differ by degree from them, and we run by the same physical and chemical systems that they do. Differ by degree, but it's the same systems. So sure, we should go look at how animals do behaviors, because it's by understanding those in the animal context that we understand where our behaviors came from, in large part. Secondly, as I said, we are chemical machines. We're just matter and energy in motion. That's all we really are. So as I said, every abnormality in man is a result, ultimately, of an energy imbalance. Energy got blocked up in some sense, and it's manifesting itself in weird energy forms. So Freud brought that idea. And just real quickly, just to set a different model, and so we have something to talk about, let's look at the picture of man that we get in Genesis. So let's start with, so day 6, all the animals have been created through the first 5-6 days. And then when it comes to man, there's a little piece that says we'll make man in our image. Well, what does that mean? I mean, what's God look like? What's his image, you know? I mean, has he got 2 arms, 2 legs? Has he got this kind of a form? And I'd argue, no, it's not any of those. But what I would argue is it's moral. And so it seems to me that what Genesis 1 is claiming is there's something unique about man. He's moral. And its claim is that only man was made in that image. No other animal has that. So this is a kind. So I find it interesting. I do a lot of work in environmental ethics. How come we never blame the dolphins for anything? How come we never blame the elephants for destroying their habitat? How come we never claim species, destroying their food supply? How come it's only man that gets blamed? I mean, if everything differs by degree, that ought not to be the way it is. Because everybody's got a little morality in them. Even earthworms got a little bit of morality, not much. But if we all differ by degree, in order for that assumption about biology to be true, everything has to differ by degree. if it is the case, man has something that no other animal has, then you got a problem, because that's not a difference of degree. That's a difference of kind. So that's a problem, if that's true. So that's the first piece I'd like us to interact with. The second piece is, we said that what came by way of Darwin and Freud, and again, lots of other people, but they're really the dominant two that brought it in 20th and 21st century, that we are really chemical machines. So let me ask a question. What's mind? What's a mind? Because if everything reduces to physics and chemistry, all there is brains and brain states. Go look at the research down here. What are we studying? We're studying how synapses fire, what the patterns look like. We're figuring out the brain. What do they say about the relationship of brain to mind? Well, the hardcore that accept that pact, that biology ultimately reduces to chemistry and physics, there is no mind. It's just brain states. There's nothing there other than the physics of a brain and energy running in a network. Well, I mean, let's think about things like love. That's just synapses firing in a particular sort of way. Think of the color blue. Where exactly is that up here? Because, I mean, anything that's material, it's got to be in space. Where is that? Where are all those pieces? All I see is tracks of synapses firing. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't deny that the brain really impacts what's happening in a mind, but how did we decide there wasn't a mind? Nobody proved it. How was it decided that we really differ by degree from animals? Well, we all know Darwin proved that, right? But did he? If you go back and look, he didn't prove it. He just assumed that we all differed by degree. It's an assumption of his theory. He never examined that. You can't examine that scientifically. It's just an assumption he made that never gets questioned any longer. So it seems to me that we find ourselves in psychology is there's a certain amount of schizophrenia, and there's a whole lot of incoherence in what we're doing and what we say we're doing, because of these kinds of issues that we've never actually slowed down and had a look and thought about. What are the implications of this, and is this really true? Those are all the assumptions that just get taken for granted. So anyway, at this point, I think we got enough on the table. Now I want to just stop and let's interact for a little bit. So is this kind of made sense? Do you see where I wanted to go with this? Okay, comments or questions? Oh yeah, we have a mic and we want to try to get the questions because I can't repeat them.
So Charlie, I'm interested in what you think the state is of the research that's occurring on the theory of evolution, and what the state is right now, if that makes any sense. It's kind of a big question, but...
Well, I on one hand, I would say there is no research going on with regard to testing it, because it's all taken for granted. It's just assumed. So when you go out to do research, that's just assumed. You're trying to explain some phenomena you see in nature using this theory.
Gotcha.
But nobody's testing that theory anymore.
Okay. So would like looking for missing links, or like, I guess what they would call like species between what Aristotle might call a species.
Uh-huh.
What type of research is that then? Is that the same type of?
Okay. Okay. Let me do this to answer your question.
Okay.
Okay. It's going to take me a minute because I got to do a preliminary step. The preliminary step is this. When we look at nature, I think there's 3 approaches to nature we can take. So there's 3 general possible theories of nature. One of them is there are kinds. I'll just say there are real kinds. Okay? The second one is there are no real kinds. Everything differs by degree. That's our difference by degree. And the third theory is it's a Marxist theory. And I'll have to explain it to you because probably nobody's ever heard of it, but actually probably more than half of the scientists actually hold this view. And I'll give you an example to show you why. Is there are kinds, but they are caused by a quantitative difference. Okay? So there are kinds, but it's caused by a quantitative difference. Let me give you an example. Here's their example. Take water. Below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, water is a solid. From 32 to 212, it's a liquid. And above 212, it's gas. I mean, solids differ from liquids that differ from gases. Those are kinds in their understanding. But what causes them, what underlays them, is a difference of just degrees of temperature. Okay? So let me give you an example. The difference between one species and the next is a difference of 2% of the frequency of their DNA. I mean, it's just quantitative difference of DNA that's given us our species, right? And so there's some scientists who claim there are real things like species. See, if you hold this view, there's no such thing as any class. There's no such thing as dogs. We made up the term. It's a convenient thing to talk about all these things. Okay? So a guy named Stephen Jay Gould, anybody heard of Stephen Jay Gould? He holds a Marxist view that there are kinds, but what they result from is differences in DNA. And I mean, we know that DNA is just the frequency of 4 acid bases in a structure. It's just quantitatively changed. We just quantitatively change some of this material, and that's how we get all these kinds. So that's a Marxist view. Okay. So everybody assumes one of those 3. All right? So what did Darwin actually do? Those who know, I wrote a book on this and actually made the argument. But there's a famous figure in Darwin. I won't get it, but I'm sure you've seen it. And it basically says we'll start out with like 7 species, and then we'll follow them over hundreds of generations, and they'll branch out all over the place like this. Okay? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've seen that kind of figure. That we'll start with these 7, and we get all these species. Some of them go extinct here, but they're kind of all changing and moving around. And so Darwin says, well, here's my figure for from 1 to 1,000 generations. This is what you get. Well, here's Darwin's next move in the next paragraph. I see no reason to assume that the same thing won't happen if you run it for 1,000,000 generations. Or 100 million generations. Because this is what's causing all of it, this mechanism. So the longer you run it, of course you're going to get everything. Well, if you think about that for a few minutes, the only way that works is if there are no kinds. The argument doesn't work if there are actually kinds that differ. Because a kind never can change into something that's not its kind. There's borders. They can't be breached if they're kinds. It can go so far, but it's only going to go so far. So how did the biologists at the time of Darwin, yeah, everybody knows the famous pigeon example, and they had bred pigeons over time that can't even fly. They fly and they tumble through the air, and they can barely feed themselves. And their point was, yeah, look how far they bred them. Look how far they pushed them. They don't even look like pigeons. But the point is, from people who hold kinds, you can only push a pigeon so far, and now it's not even viable. It can't live. There's a point at which you can't push a pigeon past where it's going to survive. You can't get a different kind of bird from a pigeon. Now, how is science going to solve that question? Well, it's not a scientific question. Science can never solve that question. It's a philosophical question. When philosophy got purged out of science, this is the kind of thing that happens. No one realizes that what's fundamentally at stake is a philosophical question, not a scientific question. So back to our 3 theories of nature. Well, which one of those 3 is right? Darwin assumed that there were no kinds. Did he prove it? Heck no. All he said was, well, here's what it looks like if you run it 1,000 generations. You can run it 1,000,000 generations and you'll get all this much more diversity. Well, that's right if nature is actually continuous, that where it differs by degree and there are no kinds. He's right, if that's true. Everybody followed Darwin. Everybody before Darwin believed that there were kinds. Now, their formulation of kinds was wrong, and Darwin was right in his critique of their framework. But Darwin's theory didn't disprove the idea of a theory of nature being kind. All he proved was the particular formulation they had come up with was false. And actually in his book, he claims, I'm just critiquing somebody who holds this view. And he was right about that. The view that he's critiquing, he's right about. But the conclusion of that is not that that the theory of nature has been decided in Darwin's favor and everything differs by degree. How does changing this from 1,000 generations to 1,000,000 generations answer that question? It doesn't. It begs the question. And Darwin and Freud brought this notion of everything different by degree, and so the foundation of virtually all modern research in psychology has largely made that assumption. Both those assumptions. That everything, that we're ultimately chemical machines and we differ by degree from animals. Go.
The seven original things on your diagram of a different kind?
Oh, no, they were just different species.
Okay.
So what's interesting is most Darwinists have actually never read Darwin. Because if you actually read Darwin, here's what he says. He says, now think of this diagram, I'm really going to draw it again, but he basically says start with 5 individual organisms, okay? And over time, those 5 individual organisms are going to form this continuum, the tree of life or the bush of life, okay? Well, think about this for a minute. What if we pick a fish, an amphibian, a reptile, a bird, and a mammal? All I wanted to say is Darwin doesn't start from 0. In his mind, these might already be existing, but in his mind, they can all intercross. But he starts out with five individuals. Was he thinking of a fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and a mammal? Yeah, maybe. And if he was, then the question is, well, you assumed this to start with. So where do these come from? Well, he isn't addressing that. And that's kind of what most of his followers don't pay any attention to. Darwin's not about the origin of life or the origin of plants and animals. He just wants to talk about how one species comes from another species. The title of the book is The Origin of Species, not The Origin of Class. So now, back to your question. No looking at fossils is ever going to solve that question of what theory of nature is true. Because if one person comes believing there's kinds and the other person comes doesn't, the conversation is not going to ever be solved by looking at fossils. Because it's not a scientific question that can be resolved by facts. I mean, that's a really long-winded answer, but did I get there?
Yeah. A lot of people backtracking.
Okay, so yeah, let's go. Whatever you want to talk about. Yes?
Well, this is all kind of new to me, but what little I know about any kind of evolution, people talk about gaining things that you might need. An animal gains something it might need. One of the things that I've seen and read about is these sightless fish in caves, and it seems like they lose things rather than gain things. And so it's more of a digression or backwards than actually getting more and more complex.
Well, okay, let me be on the other side for a minute now. If it's really true in our theory of nature that there are no kinds, if that's really true, then animals can, this is the way an evolutionist will explain this. What natural selection allows nature to do is accumulate complexity. And out of complexity, as things get more complex, then the argument is higher behaviors happen. So this is how they would say, well, this is how man sort of became moral. It's once his brain got to a certain size with a certain number of synapses, he now had the capacity to do morality, and it sort of spontaneously developed. Well, okay, if you want to believe in a theory like that, that seems to me as equally far-fetched as a God created it. I mean, both of them are pretty miraculous, if you ask me. Because if we just start mapping the size of brains and how many synapses animals have, we aren't the top dog. We're a long ways from the top dog. I mean, orcas and porpoises, they have 100 times the number, the brain size and synapses we do. So how come they aren't moral? So, you know, the way they want to answer it is just with increasing complexity, these behaviors and attributes and things will naturally, spontaneously arise. Well, okay, that's logically possible. But it's only going to work if your theory of nature is right, that everything differs by degree. Is that answering your question?
Not really.
Okay.
I was just saying, it seems like anything we see is actually happening in evolution is going backwards rather than, I mean, like sightless fishing. Like sightless
Yes.
fishing
Well,
caves.
let me give you an example of something to make this interesting. Everybody knows I'm a famous serial artist. Okay. Guess what that is? Okay. Lower 48. There's a species of frog called Rana pippins, common green frog, leopard frog. And let's just say we divide the North America into 7 zones. And there's leopard frogs in all 7 zones. We take a leopard frog from zone 1 and interbreed it with zone 2. We get fertile offspring. All of those breed normal. We take one from here and one from here. They can't interbreed. There's too much difference. Now, how are we going to explain that? Now, there's probably 500 species that show this in plants and animals. It sure looks like we're creating new species here. Okay? So this would suggest we are gaining something. We are gaining complexity here. Now, is this real? I think so. Because like I say, you can pick insects, you can pick plants, you can pick all kinds of animals. Birds, you can do this with birds. It looks like we're gaining complexity, and it looks like we're creating new species. Now, but again, are species real, or are they just conventions, something we make up? But this phenomena is real. So I think this is happening all the time. So yes, you're right. You can lose stuff, but I think there's lots of examples of gaining stuff, of gaining complexity and diversity. That's how I wanted to answer that question.
What kind of complexity are you gaining in this diagram? Are you gaining, like, okay, number 1, I can't breed with number 7 kind of complexity? I can't do that?
Well, yeah, what's happening over time, and I think this is a right explanation, that the frog over here, let me just draw it over here. Kind of what's happening is the frogs over here are kind of taking off and doing their own thing over time. And the ones over here are kind of taking off and doing their thing at one time. Because see, for frogs, there are frogs all the way across here. And so there are frogs here, 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 here. But in this part of the country, to be honest, there aren't many frogs because there isn't any water. It's all grassland and, you know, Great Basin and all that. So what's happening is these are diverging geographically, and they're losing the ability to cross. So some people define a population as a group of individuals that can interbreed. Well, looked at one way, these can interbreed yet, but we see what's happening, that over time they're kind of separating, and at some point they'll get to a point where they aren't interbreeding anymore, really. Is that?
You said they can't breed.
Yeah.
Nature says they can't?
Yeah, their offspring is not fertile.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's
now,
becoming more complex is how you describe as
or,
being.
or yeah, it's two species instead of one. Yeah. Yeah. And that's more complex.
Okay.
Yeah. So in some of these, it's not that the genetics prohibits their reproduction, it's behavioral differences. So especially in like birds, east-west coast, same species, but their behaviors are different enough that they don't breed. You probably know a few examples of that. So, yeah. But anyway, so, and insects, same thing. Lots of insects have behavioral issues or timing. Over time, these maybe start to mate and produce young 3 months before this group. So as they diverge, the timings may change. But now would I want to claim that a new species is a new kind? And the answer to that is no, because it isn't. Okay? Kinds are, you're not going to get, species are not kinds. Okay? So that's the mistake that was made by the early biologists that Darwin's right about. Species are not kinds.
And it started with his finches.
And it started with what?
With his finches, because it's the same idea of
Yeah.
what he was observing in the finches in the
Yes.
Galapagos was that they were separated geographically over time
Right,
and became unable to interbreed
right,
and became separate species. And
Right.
the people, as I understand it, that he was critiquing would have said they were all made that way,
yes.
right?
Their
Or-
assumption, virtually all biologists. Now remember, biology in the West, usually it was an avocation by clergy. I mean, biology was never a field of study in the university. It was a hobby. I mean, you were into birds or fish or whatever, and you did that. You were a clergyman, but you did this on the side. You raised pigeons, you did all this stuff. So biology was always done by the clergy. Well, what was their view? Each species is independently created by God. That's the view that Darwin's critiquing. Is he right about that? Yeah. I mean, we get new species. We see new species happening. But are those kinds? I don't think so. So where are kinds? Now that's a tough one. I don't know exactly how to define that yet. But that's the question. Is just because you prove there aren't kinds at the level of species, that doesn't mean that higher up the scale of time and space and stuff that there aren't kinds. I mean, just because this happens, does that mean that man isn't a kind? Of course not. But that was the assumption that was made, and it's accepted by everybody today. There are no kinds. Go.
So could we shift gears a little bit and
Sure.
talk about the implications for modern day psychology?
Well, you tell me what
For-
those are.
Oh.
I'm not a psychiatrist. No, I said right off the bat is I'm not a psychologist, and that's not fundamentally well. But we've already laid out some of them. But you guys that are studying it or working it, you tell me what they are. So let's put them up here. What are they? I mean, am I right about that? About everything differs by degree. We go look at the animals. Man's not unique. We're all chemical machines. Is there anybody you read in like neurophysiology or?
Well, I can think of an implication that kind of in common treatment circles, I would say.
Okay.
So not research, but and it goes back to one of the things that I was talking about in my talk about that the purpose of therapy, for example, is to help people feel better rather than to help people live better lives or find fulfillment or true eudaimonia. And so I'm thinking about the implication of this view of humankind as a machine. And it's like, okay, if something's going wrong, if I'm not feeling good in my life, the explanation is that something's wrong with my machine.
Right. It's a
rather
chemical
than
problem.
it's a chemical problem. And that is so thick in our culture these days. And I don't mean just like the use of medications. I mean, that's an implication of it. But I think just in general, it's very much kind of a neurobiological view that says we just got to get your brain working right, and then you won't struggle in this way, rather than kind of understanding the complexity of being the possessor of a soul.
Right.
To not put too fine a point on it.
Yeah. Anybody else?
That's complicated
Yeah.
to have a soul.
Well, and actually, just to comment on psychology, just as a philosopher looking at psychology from 50,000 feet, is there's really kind of, how many? Let's see, at least two. Yeah, maybe I'll call it a third. We'll see when I get there. But one is sort of the empirical approach to psychology. Is what are we? Well, we're a passive mind that we start with a blank slate and the environment creates us completely. So associative psychology, 19th and early 20th century. It's all empirically based. We start with a blank slate, nothing. Our mind is passive, everything's done to us. Okay, so we're just a product of our environment. Well, if that's your starting assumption of a human being, well, you can track out where that goes. And the majority of people, I shouldn't say that, I'll let you guys answer that. You tell me. So that's one side, is the empirical side. Okay? That passive, we get everything from the environment. The other side is a more rationalistic. And that is, yeah, we get sensations, but we determine what they mean. So Kant's a good example of someone of that sort of ilk. So in psychology, it would be, well, we're getting inputs, but hey, it's our cultural context, it's our individual context. The context is what determines everything. So the context determines how you're going to process these inputs. So in the first view, the mind was totally passive. In this view, you are shaping reality. You are determining what's real. Now, that's the other side. Now, there are psychologists doing that. So my hunch is more of them are on the empirical side than on the rational side, but I might be wrong. I'm, as I say, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know. I don't know how they'd think about that, but I would suspect more are empirical than they are rational, but I don't know. Does that distinction make difference? Do you see how you're thinking about people and their environment different in those two, just those two contexts? So there we have just a method difference in addition to these kind of things. Hopefully that didn't just confuse. Hopefully that wasn't confusing. Go ahead.
am confused
Okay.
about the rational view. I
The-
get the empirical one, but could you say a
Okay.
little bit more about the rational one?
Sure.
And maybe tying it to Kant would help me.
Okay. Well, let me try it this way. If you're an empiricist, experience just happens to you. It's like, you're watching a movie. It's a stream of consciousness. It's just happening. The rational critique of that is, well, that may be going on, but the point is you can't know or understand anything if it's just a passive mind with a stream of consciousness going. You have to have some framework to figure out what's meaningful and how it all fits together. So their interest is in that part, how it all fits together. Is that helping a bit? And so the rational, the folks doing, so the mind and the individual makeup and the is even genetics is more important in this context than in the other context.
Okay, I get it.
Okay.
It's kind of like nature versus nurture.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
rational is the nature that it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Is the rational view that you're talking about. And then empirical view would be more kind of like this
The nurture.
passive mind that's just experiencing things.
Yeah, yeah. The environment
But
creates it
Yeah.
on the empirical side, and you're imposing your will on the environment on this side.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I was after. And that's just a philosophical assumption you've made about method. That's taking you to totally different questions. And as I say, it seems to be nobody thinks about the implications of that. Because that's a philosophical question, it's not a scientific question.
So I want to leave Darwin and Freud with some dignity in my question, but it's kind of a socio-historical question, Charlie. So, I mean, humanity has been at no lack of theories to explain why we do what we do. 2,500 years ago it was the gods who made me fall in love. Now it's my chemicals in a closed system rather than an open system. So do you have thoughts about why it is that, and again, I don't mean to use the word myth in a disparaging sense, but given the number of undemonstrated, unproven assumptions that are kind of driving Darwin's and Freud's frameworks about how we understand humanity and how it operates. So I'm just going to use the word myth to refer to that framework, not in a saying it's, now that I'm not saying I think it's true or not true, I'm not making that comment, but
I follow you.
As a social model for interpreting humanity, that's what I mean by myth in this question. Why do you think that we have come to prefer Freud's myth over, say, Venus made me fall in love, and now it's some other kind of explanation?
Part of the answer is, it seems to me that there has been a change, there has been a change in man's worldview. Early man was very religious. So all the early civilizations that we know of are all religious. And religion is intimately tied with politics, and everything about your life is religious. It seems to me, and again, I've thought about this, but I've not I'm too old to do this, so maybe some younger person could see if this works. But my assumption is, yeah, early man was religious, so they had lots of religious options. And one of those, obviously, was the Jewish perspective, monotheism. The rest were polytheists. But they were all at least religious. It seems to me one way to read history is that man is increasingly running away from God. And so I mean, that is manifested. So part of the answer is, I mean, they're doing religious stuff and it's all in the context of gods. And I mean, but at least they recognize that God is an invisible force acting in nature. That at least they accept that idea. They have the wrong idea of the ultimate force creating reality, I would say. But, you know, once you get to the Enlightenment, look at what it is. It's, we can solve all the human dilemmas and give ourselves meaning and significance in life through material prosperity, basically. And so it seems to me that we've really made a shift in where we think the meaning is going to come from. I mean, am I even getting at your question?
I mean, you are. It's not a. It's a question with plenty of kind of undefined terms. I mean, you're definitely getting at it. I guess another way to frame the question is the kind of Freud-Darwin soup that we're all swimming in and are very comfortable with, is that different by degree or different by kind from what the polytheists were doing?
Oh, I'd say different by degree.
Could you say a little bit more about what you mean?
Well, well, let me try this. Some people have argued that there never was an atheist before like 1860. Now, why 1860 could you become an atheist in a way that no one else could before? And the argument is put forward that by that time, man had created an urban environment that was so alienated from the natural world that man saw that he controlled everything about his environment and his destiny. Now, okay, we might argue that's a change in kind. We might. I'm not quite willing to go there. Before that, there was a recognition that there are these, and I find the whole question of atheism really interesting because some of the most vocal atheists I know have a cardiac every time the stock market goes down 2,000 points. And I'm thinking, a God is an invisible force that controls your life. Is the stock market not a God? So on one hand, I don't think anything's changed. I mean, but yet our whole understanding has changed. So I wanted to acknowledge that our understanding has changed to the point where lots of people would now say, well, I don't believe in gods. I don't believe in God at all. Well, I beg to differ. But there has been a change in their whole perspective. Now, I'm not willing to call it a change of kind yet because of that nature, that the same thing's going on that went on with polytheism. Is that making sense?
To summarize, it sounds like you're saying something different from we've just relabeled Venus serotonin.
Yeah.
Done something different there, but not different enough for it to be a different kind of thing. That at bedrock, there's still some assumption or undefined explanation that the theory, such as it is, must ride upon and we just kind of go from theory to theory
Yeah.
as convenient, or feel like we can make progress in a field, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Is that
So this isn't exactly an answer, but I think it's one of the main points to come out of this is, well, why were Darwin and Freud accepted at that point in time? And just accepted virtually by everyone. And 5 years later, no one questions it. Well, in the case of Darwin, it's everybody was looking for that explanation that didn't include God. That we now have an explanation of why it looks like there's kinds, but there aren't. So now we can explain all of biology, all the history of the planet in purely materialistic terms. So we can be materialists now. So I would say the 19th century was anticipating and waiting anxiously for that explanation. So in Freud, now the problem for Freud was he was never really kind of accepted as a scientist. One of the ironies is the scientific community, as I understand it, the psychologists of the time basically said, well, this isn't science. There's nothing scientific about this. So he was not accepted by the scientific community, but he was accepted by, I'll call them cultural creatives, the intelligentsia. They foisted him on psychiatry early. Yeah, he never would have been the person he was without that social phenomena. At least that's my reading of it.
He also, there's some evidence that he caved to social pressure about his theories about hysteria and the relationship with sexual trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where his, one author I've read says that's where his psychosexual development theory came from, was when he began to see so many cases of hysteria that it would mean that a lot of people were being sexually abused, that that was not something that the culture wanted to hear about or know about. And so, and he apparently pushed it for a while until apparently his own sister claimed that his father had abused her, at which point he made it a psychosexual theory, that it was repressed stuff that never happened, that these women were expressing or experiencing. And I just find that fascinating because that became so definitive in his model.
But there's another piece of his model in addition to that is the way the model actually in the end got formulated, it's really not testable because the model explains every case.
That's right.
And so, I mean, if a theory explains every case, does it explain anything? Yeah, you know what I mean? I mean, it's got an explanation for every possible scenario you could have. You can't.
How does that work?
So in other words, it's not something you could test and prove.
Right.
It's true because it contains all the possible options. Now, is that a good theory or a bad theory? Now, philosophers are still waxing on that one. But basically, most people are not inclined to accept a theory that's all-inclusive, that you couldn't present. It's theoretically impossible to present a counterexample. That's another way of saying this.
I don't know exactly how to ask the question that I want, but one of the things that's alluring about Freud's project, or the sort of psychological project overall, is that it provides a reasoning or a causation behind why we act the way we act. it kind of strips us of our autonomy. It says we don't have like a sort of pure being, so to speak, right? Like we have these unconscious motivations that ultimately can be led back to this energy, this libido,
Okay.
or something, right? But
Yeah.
you can follow it from a developmental, like a very young age, and see that there are these influences on people's lives, and that's why we turn out the way we are. And there's more or less a kind of like that's the allure to some degree. And my question that I was hoping you would address at some level tonight is in terms of the biblical model of man. What is there something that's alluring? I mean, you talked about the morality as as a component of like us in the image of God, but there's something that rings a little. It sounded like I was going to say false, and that's not where I'm going. I wanted to say there's something not very. The picture isn't filled out. The picture of man, so to speak.
Right.
And so, what causes man to react or act in certain ways is do you have something in mind that you can talk about that the division between, I guess, a more or less like an autonomous thinking moral agent and this what Freud presents, which is kind of like a fractured self, right?
Okay.
Like a self who isn't in control of his self.
All right. I haven't thought a lot about this, but
Yeah.
I've thought a little about that. As I say, I'm not a psychologist, so. But in thinking about most animals are driven almost entirely by instinct. Now, I mean, within that context, even earthworms can learn, can learn certain behaviors. So there's not a complete dichotomy between instinct and not instinct. So when we come to human beings, we're not primarily driven by instinct, it seems to me. There are some instincts. So, for example, take Freud's example of sucking. Sucking's necessary for a baby. If a baby doesn't suck, they're dead. So why does the baby suck? Well, his explanation is it's pleasurable. And he ties that pleasure to, and the baby isn't conscious of it, they're just conscious of pleasure. But behind that is all the Darwinian mechanisms of this is what's necessary to get you through this stage so that now you can perpetuate the species. Because that's the purpose of a fit person for Freud. That's the purpose. Now, so it seems to me that humans, that part of being a moral being is we do have some instincts, but not many. But what we do have, and Freud was onto this, but I think he was wrong about the source of it. There are developmental stages. Anyone that's followed kids from months to years, there is kind of a predictable pattern of what they can do when you're going to learn to walk, when you're going to learn to talk, when you're going to learn to eat yourself, toilet training, all of this kind of stuff. Well, in Freud's analysis, all of that developmental stuff is driven by one thing: sex. And it seems to me that, I'm not going to deny that that's a powerful drive, but I would argue that's very far from being the only drive. Because if we tried to envision a culture that actually ran on that model, that every behavior by a human being is determined by some element of sexual development, that'd be incomprehensible to me. So it seems like to me that there are developmental theories. I was just trying to think of another. There's another one that's more recent. Erikson, yes. So Erikson has a view. And he's laying out development the same way, as a process, the same way Freud is. But it's got a totally different context. And it's got a context more like a moral being. I don't know enough about it to say if it is. I mean, that theory, I haven't looked at it that closely. But again, it gives us a developmental theory, but it's not grounded on the same underpinnings, nor is it grounded on the same causal mechanisms that Freud's is. So it seems to me that Erikson's model is a much better model than Freud's. I mean, I don't know if it's right. I haven't looked at it enough. I don't know, but it certainly seems to me to be more realistic about that a human being isn't one-dimensional, and behaviors are largely determined by one dimension. We're more complex than that. So, Nancy, yeah, bail me out here because I'm kind of over my head. I mean, like I say, I've not studied Erikson carefully. I just know I've seen and heard the model, and that seems like a plausible model to me.
I like his model. Yeah, I agree. I was thinking about your question, though, about like Freud versus the Bible. And I was thinking about, I feel like the view of the unconscious that Freud helped us start to understand and develop, I think it's really consistent with a biblical view of man, in the sense of we are driven by things that we don't know about until we know about them. Mm-hmm. and that seems consistent to me with a moral mm-hmm. human that is really complicated. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, I just thought I'd throw that in there, because I think they really fit together.
Yeah, but with this exception, that in Freud's view, the unconscious is, I can't remember his term, but it's at least irrational. I mean, it's not rational.
Right, and I would disagree with him on that.
Yeah.
And the biblical view, it's rational.
Right, and so the idea of like tacit, well, it seems to me that's perfectly compatible with a biblical view. So the idea that we're more complicated than we can know, yeah, I think that's basically a biblical view. That I don't know why I think I know what I know. I mean, I've looked at little pieces of it, but where did the rest of it come from? So, but just to say, that would be the difference. Freud's view, the unconscious, it's driven by that causal mechanism, and it's not related to rationality or morality. It's just related to material energy.
Right.
And that part, yeah, that's not compatible. And so I think the biblical one is complicated. It's difficult for us to tease that all apart. And we know a lot more than we can articulate. So that part's true. So I think that's perfectly that part's compatible with Freud.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to insist on a compatibility. I was more asking for an alternate or an alternative that you would say is biblical. And Nancy hinted at that in some ways. Nancy. I don't know which one of you said this now. Sorry, but one of the two of you said man is more or less a mystery. I think you said that, but you kind of pushed him there.
Yeah.
But the idea that man as a mystery is itself maybe a more biblical worldview rather than having a theory that explains man away, so to speak.
Yeah.
Reductionist.
Yeah.
So you said that, and you said the bit about more or less this unconscious desire, which you could pretty easily tie into Paul saying, I do things I don't want to do or mean to do,
right.
et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, that's what you added. And then you said the mystery bit. And I think I was thinking more along those lines, is what do you have in mind when you think of the title, Freud versus the Bible? I was curious what kind of man you would
Well,
bring to the table.
again, the way I framed it was was Freud versus the Bible, looking at those underpinnings, what those assumptions were that underlie both views. So that's what I intended, and that was the central part. But as I say, that's why we still have time. We can go there even more if you want to go there more.
Oh, I feel okay about your answer, so thank you. But
Okay.
you're welcome to keep it going if you want.
Sure, if people want to. I'm here for a while. I'm still going. Anybody else?
I just have a question for Nancy. Or you, Charlie. You might be able to answer this question. I'm just interested in how Jung deviated from Freud, and specifically on whether or not man is fundamentally mechanical, and if there's more of a difference than what people generally think or not.
Do you want
I think you know more about Jung, I think, than I do.
Sorry, I was only half listening to the question. Will you can you rephrase it and I'll try to.
Yeah, sure. It would just be, in what ways does Jung differ from Freud in the idea that man is fundamentally mechanical?
Oh, I see. I don't know. Is this on?
No, it needs to be
No, it needs to be read.
I mean, there's certainly more mystery in Jung. At some level, I would say Jung and Freud split over the question of Freud wanting to reduce everything to a sexual drive, and Jung thought there was something more mysterious. And ultimately, he talks about archetypes and gets into a lot of religious mythology. And in some ways, he was driven by this kind of like his Protestant upbringing. You can see that he has this real desire to know something other than himself. And so, I mean, I don't know how to exactly answer it other than he tried to acknowledge a kind of like something that was non-materialistic. That's ultimately, I think some of it was he felt like there was a dignity to ultimately what, if man is merely just sexual energy, that means all of man's art and everything that we produce culturally is also just a reflection of that as well. And then, at the highest level of like society itself, there seems to be something greater than sexual energy going on there. And I think that was, for Jung, he just couldn't reduce it to that. And so he wanted to more or less, I suppose, have a psychology that gave dignity to those things at some level. I'm also not a Jungian, like, I had an interest in him for a while, so.
I remember that.
Yeah.
That's all good, just thinking, because I needed a little bit more elaboration in general.
Yeah.
Anything else? All right, sounds like we're done. Thanks.
Thanks, Riley.